When I first decided to buy a house in the city, I thought it would be the start of a perfect new chapter. As a software engineer, I've worked hard to build a stable life, and this house was meant to reflect that success. But more than that, it was for my parents. After years of their sacrifices, I wanted them to enjoy their retirement in comfort. It felt like the least I could do. The house was everything I had hoped for, cozy yet spacious enough to feel open. It had 3 bedrooms and a small yard, perfect for the quiet life I imagined for us. The master bedroom became my sanctuary, a place to retreat after long workdays. I turned one of the spare rooms into an office, complete with a sleek desk and the fastest internet I could get my hands on. The 3rd bedroom, a bright and welcoming space, served as a guest room for the occasional visitor. The house quickly became my pride and joy, a symbol of the life I had built for myself and my parents. Funding this new lifestyle wasn't easy, but I never thought twice about it. Between the mortgage, utilities, and groceries, it added up quickly, but every cent felt worth it. Seeing my parents, Margaret and James, enjoying their mornings on the patio or their evenings watching old movies made me feel like I had finally given back a fraction of what they had given me. Together, we turned the house into a home. We painted the walls, planted flowers in the yard, and even hung up a family portrait in the living room. Those early weeks were some of the happiest I'd had in years. I felt like I was finally in control, providing stability and comfort for the 2 people who had given me so much. But the calm didn't last long. One evening, during a quiet dinner, my mother mentioned something that made my stomach drop. She started talking about my sister, Emily, and her husband, Ryan. Apparently, they had some big news. They were expecting their first child and were planning to move to the city to be closer to family. At first, I was happy for them. Becoming an aunt sounded exciting. But there was something in my mother's tone, a kind of expectation, that set me on edge. The next few days, her casual mentions of Emily and Ryan became more frequent. She spoke about how challenging things were for them financially and how much easier it would be if they had family nearby to support them. It wasn't long before I pieced together where this was heading. My home, the one I had worked so hard to create, was suddenly under threat of becoming someone else's solution to their problems. My concerns only grew when my mother began talking about how wonderful it would be to have a baby in the house. She painted this idyllic picture of a bustling family home filled with laughter and new beginnings. But all I could think about was the invasion of my carefully constructed life. I had built this home for my parents and me, not for Emily and Ryan to swoop in and disrupt everything. The breaking point came one afternoon when my mother casually dropped the bombshell. Without so much as consulting me, she had invited Emily and Ryan to stay with us, temporarily, once they moved to the city. She justified it as a way to help them get on their feet before the baby arrived. The decision was made, apparently, without any input from me, the person who owned the house, paid the bills, and had built this life from the ground up. I felt a wave of emotions crash over me: anger, betrayal, and, above all, a sense of powerlessness. How could she make such a decision without even asking me? This was my home, my safe space, and now it felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I didn't know how to respond, but one thing was clear: this was just the beginning of a much bigger storm. The day Emily and Ryan moved in, I hoped, against my better judgment, that we could find a way to coexist peacefully. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. From the very beginning, they acted as though the house belonged to them. They barely unpacked before making themselves at home in every possible way, leaving their things scattered in the common areas and taking over the kitchen with their endless demands and messes. What started as minor irritations quickly snowballed into something I could no longer ignore. Emily, now heavily pregnant, began to drop subtle hints about needing more space. She spoke about how the baby would require a quiet environment and how inconvenient the guest room was for someone in her condition. I tried to remind myself that pregnancy was stressful and perhaps she didn't mean to sound entitled, but it became harder to hold on to that belief. The final straw came when she suggested, not so subtly, that they should have the master bedroom because it's only fair for the baby's sake. I couldn't believe the audacity. The master bedroom was my retreat, the only place in the house where I could still feel in control. I refused outright, stating that the guest room was more than adequate and that this arrangement was always meant to be temporary. But my refusal didn't sit well with either Emily or Ryan. Their passive-aggressive remarks turned into outright hostility, and the tension in the house became unbearable. Then came the day that tipped everything over the edge. I had gone out for a quick coffee run, hoping for a moment of peace away from the suffocating atmosphere. When I returned, I was greeted by a sight that left me frozen in disbelief. Emily was in my master bedroom, surrounded by my belongings, which she had packed into boxes and bags. She was moving my things out, piece by piece, as though I had no say in the matter. The air seemed to leave the room. My heart raced as I watched her rearrange my sanctuary without a hint of remorse. When I finally found my voice and demanded to know what she was doing, she simply said it was the logical thing to do, given her pregnancy. Ryan stood nearby, arms crossed, as if daring me to argue further. Margaret's reaction was equally disheartening. When I confronted her about Emily's actions, she didn't seem surprised. Instead, she defended her, insisting that families should help each other and that Emily needed the space more than I did. Her words felt like a betrayal, a confirmation that she had chosen sides, and it wasn't mine. It became clear to me in that moment that no one was going to stand up for me. If I wanted to keep my boundaries intact, I would have to do it myself. Taking a deep breath, I gathered the courage to speak my mind. I told Emily and Ryan that they had two choices: either stay in the guest room as originally agreed or find another place to live. There would be no further discussions or compromises. Their shocked expressions were almost satisfying, but I knew this was far from over. As I walked away, I felt a mix of fear and determination. For the first time since they arrived, I was taking back control of my home. What came next, however, was anyone's guess. After setting the boundary with Emily and Ryan, I hoped things would improve, or at least stabilize, but I was wrong. The tension in the house thickened, and the air felt charged with unspoken resentment. To avoid the inevitable conflicts, I threw myself into work. My office became more than just a workspace, it became a refuge. I spent hours behind that desk, immersed in projects, trying to ignore the growing storm just beyond the door. Emily and Ryan's passive-aggressive behavior became impossible to ignore. They barely spoke to me, and when they did, their words were clipped and laced with sarcasm. At family dinners, they acted as if I wasn't there. Emily would speak over me, and Ryan would make pointed comments about how hard it was to live under someone else's roof. Margaret, either oblivious or choosing to avoid conflict, said nothing. Her silence felt like another betrayal. The groceries became another battleground. I'd stock the fridge with enough food to last a week, but by midweek, it would be nearly empty. It wasn't just the quantity that disappeared, but the way it happened, quietly, without a word of acknowledgement or thanks. The expensive ingredients I bought for meal prep vanished overnight, replaced by empty shelves and passive excuses. They didn't even bother to contribute or ask if I needed anything when they went shopping. One evening, after a particularly draining day, I opened the fridge to find it almost completely bare. The sight of a lone carton of milk and a half-eaten salad felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the food, it was the principle. I was supporting this household, putting up with their behavior, and they were treating me like an afterthought in my own home. That was the moment I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, tiptoeing around my own house and feeling like a stranger in the space I had worked so hard to build. It wasn't just about the food or the passive aggressiveness. It was about respect, or the complete lack of it. The guilt weighed heavily on me as I made my decision. I didn't want to be the villain in my own family, but I also couldn't continue to let them take advantage of me. I knew Emily and Ryan wouldn't leave willingly, and Margaret would likely take their side. But I had reached my limit. Something had to give. That night, I drafted a notice of eviction. It felt cold and formal, but I needed to set clear boundaries. They had 24 hours to pack their things and leave. The weight in my chest lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of resolve. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was reclaiming control over my life. The next morning, I waited until everyone was gathered for breakfast. Without a word, I placed the envelope in front of Emily and Ryan and walked away. My hands trembled, but I kept my head high. Whatever came next, I knew I had done what needed to be done. When Emily and Ryan read the notice, the storm I had anticipated erupted almost immediately. Emily's voice broke the silence first, filled with disbelief and outrage. Ryan quickly followed, accusing me of being heartless and selfish. Their words were sharp, aiming to wound, but I held my ground. I had prepared myself for this moment, knowing it wouldn't be easy. They refused to leave, declaring that I was overreacting and painting me as the villain in front of Margaret. My mother's expression was torn, but she said nothing to defend me. Instead, she let them vent their frustrations, which only fueled their confidence. Emily called me a cruel sister, emphasizing how much stress her pregnancy was causing and blaming me for adding to it. I reminded them that this house was my home and that I had been supporting everyone, financially and emotionally, without complaint. I pointed out how I had been buying groceries, paying bills, and ensuring everyone had a roof over their heads while receiving nothing but disregard in return. My voice stayed steady, even as their arguments grew louder. Ryan tried to challenge me, bringing up past family memories to guilt me, but I cut him off, repeating that my decision was final. The atmosphere grew tense, and for a moment, I thought they might refuse outright. But then Emily, seeing that I wasn't going to back down, resorted to a different tactic. She tried to appeal to my sympathy, tears streaming down her face as she spoke about the baby and how difficult things were for them. It tugged at something inside me, but I reminded myself why I had made this decision in the first place. Allowing them to stay would only prolong the toxicity that had taken over our home. I calmly told them that I wasn't doing this to be cruel, but because boundaries needed to be respected. I had worked hard to create a safe and comfortable life for myself and our parents, and their actions had shown complete disregard for that effort. Ryan's anger gave way to quiet defeat, and Emily's tears became less insistent as they realized I wouldn't relent. Eventually, they began to pack their things. It wasn't without drama. Every item they boxed came with a comment meant to sting, but I didn't engage. Margaret lingered in the background, clearly uncomfortable, but she didn't intervene. For once, it felt like she understood that this conflict was something I had to handle on my own. By the time they finished packing, the house felt different. It was quieter, emptier, but also lighter. Emily tried one last time to appeal to me as they stood by the door, asking if I was sure about this decision. I nodded firmly, reminding her that respect and boundaries were necessary for any relationship to thrive. Without another word, they left. As the door closed behind them, I took a deep breath. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was the one that was needed. The house was finally mine again, and for the first time in months, it felt like a home. With Emily and Ryan gone, the house felt like it was finally breathing again. The silence that replaced their constant tension wasn't empty, it was peaceful. For the first time in months, I could walk into my home without bracing myself for passive-aggressive remarks or uncomfortable confrontations. It felt as though a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying had been lifted. The following days were an adjustment, but a welcome one. I focused on reclaiming the spaces they had overtaken. Rearranging my office and restoring the guest room to its original state felt like a symbolic reclaiming of my life. It wasn't just about the physical changes. It was about restoring the balance I had lost. The quiet moments alone with my thoughts, something I hadn't experienced in a long time, reminded me of why I had fought so hard to take back control. My father, Richard, surprised me by quietly voicing his support. One evening, as we sat on the patio watching the sun dip below the horizon, he told me he understood why I had made the decision. He admitted that he had been concerned about the situation but didn't want to interfere. His words were simple, but carried a depth of understanding that brought me an unexpected sense of relief. It meant more to me than I could express. Margaret, however, struggled to accept the outcome. She wasn't openly confrontational, but her disappointment lingered in the way she avoided conversations about Emily and Ryan. I knew she hoped I'd relent, that I'd eventually reach out and smooth things over, but I also knew that wasn't possible. not without losing the sense of self I had fought so hard to protect. I sat down with my parents one evening to address the unspoken tension. I explained that my decision wasn't about rejecting family, but about establishing boundaries. I told them that while I loved and valued our family, respect had to be mutual. I wouldn't tolerate being taken advantage of, not even by people I cared about. It was a difficult conversation, but one that felt necessary. Richard nodded in agreement, while Margaret remained silent, her eyes focused on the table. I hoped, in time, she'd come to understand. As the weeks passed, the sense of calm in the house grew stronger. Without the constant strain of unresolved conflict, my relationship with my parents began to heal. We started spending more time together, enjoying simple things like movie nights or quiet breakfasts. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the house truly felt like a home again. I also took time to reflect on the entire ordeal. It wasn't easy to admit that I had let things spiral so far before taking action. But looking back, I realized that the experience had taught me a valuable lesson. Boundaries weren't just about keeping others in check, they were about protecting my own well-being. Sometimes, even with family, you had to draw a line to preserve your sense of self. As I stood in the doorway of my now peaceful home, I felt a sense of pride. Not just for what I had built, but for the strength it took to defend it. This house was more than just a place to live. It was a testament to my resilience and growth. And as I looked ahead, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next, armed with the lessons this chapter of my life had taught me.